your flower times, the date at which you harvest are vastly different in an extract system versus a flowering system. So there's a certain point throughout the flowering cycle where yield will outpace potency. And this has been proven. And so it is in your best interest to harvest early in some cases to optimize your potency per pound so that your extraction efficiency is optimized at that point. Whereas if I were to harvest at that same date for finished flower, the flower wouldn't even visually look finished in some cases.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we got a very special guest, Travis Higginbotham, CEO of Diligence Horticulture. Travis, thanks for taking the time. How are you doing today?
Hey, Brian, I'm doing good. Been a long time listener of this podcast, so appreciate y'all reaching out to me and eager to dive into it.
Excited to dive in. Kellen, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Really excited to talk to Travis. Really excited to dig into cultivation and some of the efficiencies that can be gained there. And it's just nice to be able to kind of chat with someone who's currently on the West Coast and really loves being out on the West Coast. You know what I mean, Brian? How are you doing?
Absolutely. I think it's totally fair to love the West Coast. The sunshine is a beautiful thing. But I think when you talk about loyalty, you talk about family and roots and where you went to school. And I think that's the important part. So Travis, where's your family located and where do your heart and your roots lie? East Coast, West Coast?
Yeah, strong question there. No, the majority of my family is in South Carolina. I went to school at Clemson and Virginia Tech, so I am a Southern boy at heart. You better believe it.
That's not East, Brian. I want the record to know he said Southern boy, not East Coast.
And one would say Colorado's not West, but here we are, right? So Travis, before we dive in, for our listeners unfamiliar, can you give a little background about yourself and how you found your way to the cannabis space?
Sure. So, I again grew up in South Carolina to a degree. My father was military, so we grew up in a conservative military Southern Baptist family. And growing up, cannabis or weed was never in the discussion, right? This was just not something part of my life. And originally, I was not on the track to go into plant science or crop production. I was actually on the track to be a classical piano professor. And so anyway, for the majority of my young life, I probably took piano for about 13 years. Rich musical history within my family, long story. But I figured I would share kind of the first time I came in contact with cannabis. I ended up having a joint one day on the way to a friend's party. And this was while I was at Lander University. I was majoring for classical piano performance. Music was life. The first time I had that cannabis on that drive was probably one of the most magical times of my life, really. I remember it to this day. Like, I remember sitting in the back of the car. It was dark. Stars were out. Sweet Disposition by Temper Tramp was playing, and I was just like in bliss. Anyway, the next day, even though I did get pretty darn stoned the night before, the next day I went to practice piano, and it's as if something was unlocked in my brain. That was my first introduction to this crop as well as what it could possibly do. And from then on, I've been kind of hooked as to what are the possibilities of this crop, enhancing, well-being in life in general. So that's been my little personal interest. But no, long story, get out of music, got my bachelor's in horticulture at Clemson University, working under Dr. Jim Faust there, worked in his lab for about 3 years, and then got into the industry as director of research for one of the top 100 growers in the U.S., Battlefield Farms, and helped build a research and development department for that company. While I was doing that, had multiple great opportunities to work in all different facets of horticulture. So everything from rearing microorganisms for biocontrols to working directly with Lowe's and working with lobby groups on pesticide issues and environmental certifications, to focusing on sole source, photoperiodic, and supplemental lighting in a greenhouse, indoors, on irrigation booms, acclimating tissue culture, you name it, to working with about 50 different global breeding companies in relation to product development and variety selection, not only for our business at the time, but also for Lowe's nationwide. So ended up being one of the 4 research council members for Lowe's on product development, and really enjoyed that. And at the same time was tasked with trialing and growing, in some cases, as many as 200 different species. 3,000 varieties a year. And so learned a lot about crops quick that way, but was with Battlefield for a few years. It's where I earned my spurs. To this day, probably have not had a mentor like I had then, Mark Verdell, head grower of Battlefield, who taught me my foundational crop science, background in general. So I got to put that plug in there. But after that, I was courted by Fluence to help them build a global technical support team. So I left Battlefield and went over to Fluence, and that was kind of my introduction into the cannabis industry, was working with them. So we created a technical support service that complemented sales of their most strategic clients in North America, Europe, and Australia, and built teams to support those accounts. Also worked in tomato vine crops, cucumbers, leafy greens at that time. And it was a wild ride. You'd be out consulting on the Golden Coast in Australia, and then, jump over in an underground bunker in Germany to then, work going and visiting Lasse at Kronos at the size of Costco indoor facility in Canada. So it was all over the board, learned a great deal about the crop with the foundational understanding that I had. I then was in the midst of all of this, I got my master's in horticulture from Virginia Tech, and that was focused on plant pathology, the interactions of trichoderma and other microbials in relation to crop performance, and also prevention of disease, and played a little bit with UV and a few other things in that area too. But yeah, most recently, well, I guess after Fluence, I went and worked with Allison Justice down at the hemp mine in South Carolina. It's an opportunity for me to go back home. She was spearheading some really exciting things in the state, really being a leader with cannabis and at the time hemp. And so I thought that was a great opportunity. We knew each other back in school, was able to go back home and did that for a few years, focused on a go-to-market strategy with hemp genetics for field farmers throughout the U.S. So we worked with multiple universities, had regional trials to validate the performance of the genetics, and then we took this to market with field farmers all over the U.S. So did that for some time. We all kind of know where the hemp market is right now, and so had to make some hard decisions based on where that market went. But most recently have been working as vice president of cultivation for State House Holdings, so large single state operator in California. Was originally hired as VP of production at Harborside, and then went through a four-way merger with State House, and then was VP of cultivation. So did that for about 3 years. They have close to 250,000 square feet of greenhouse between two locations. And I was incredibly proud of what we were able to do with that cultivation business unit within State House. But yeah, now here we are. I've since left State House and started Due Diligence Horticulture. Been in business for about 8 months now, roughly. And yeah, we're having a lot of fun.
So let's dive into cannabis cultivation. In your opinion, do you think the way current businesses are structured successfully, or they need to alter their way to adjust how they should be going for the future?
Yeah, so each cannabis business, and specifically each cultivation system, is vastly different from one another. There's no standardization. There's no systematic design. There's no real horticultural production foundation in most cultivation or cannabis cultivation businesses. And so that brings Due Diligence Horticulture a big opportunity, right? And so it's been fascinating for me, really, Brian, to kind of step into some of these businesses. And these businesses have some exceptional individuals and really exciting ideas in relation to product development and go-to-market strategy, and incredibly robust sales and finance, and experts on the team. But then I look at even the forecast of yields over a year in a greenhouse, and we're not even talking about seasonality nor the impact of that on costs and yields, right, within their entire business and financial model. And then at the same time, there's still a lot of bro science out there that's influencing certain aspects of the business, which is now starting to really, really hurt businesses.
What's bro science? Just so we're on the same page.
Well, and I want to be sensitive to how I refer to this, because there's still a lot that many legacy growers, have discussed or thought about in relation to influencing this crop that we still don't yet know about, right? But bro science, meaning just going about this crop in a, not formally horticulturally educated manner, right? And so in relation to fertilizers, in relation to how long you flower the crop, in relation to how you determine when you harvest and why, and then, let's not even get into how quality is determined, which is just this subjective box of worms. And so, yeah, it's all over the board.
I think that's important to highlight, right? Because we've heard cannabis is more art than science. And I think one of the areas that you've seen, just given your breadth of experience between all the operations, is cannabis is a plant and it can pull from other horticulture opportunities and other best practices that I think you've established and brought to the industry. So I'd love for you to kind of elaborate a little bit more on that, right? Like when you're talking about cultivation, take us through like the baseline of some operations have these type of tools or these type of foundational SOPs, and other ones are lacking these, or other ones should consider these. Just give us like a little balance of like what some have and what others should consider.
Yeah. So when I walk into a facility, whether it be indoor or greenhouse, one of the first things I'm looking for is, what is your foundation production schedule here? Right? How are you scheduling people? How are you scheduling plant count? We have no access to automation yet because we don't have scale nor stable seed. So in some cases, everything has to be touched, moved, pinched, whatever. And so how are we managing people? How are we managing our area? And how are we managing that area within a specific timestamp on a weekly schedule? And so some systems are still doing 9 to 10 weeks of flowering. They're harvesting every other week, right? They have cycle times that are as long as 18 to 20 weeks. Right? The longer the cycle, the longer cash is tied up. And in many cases, some of this isn't even properly validated. Like, why are you growing for 10 weeks? Or why are you flowering for 10 weeks? Like, why do we feel we need to do that? And I never get a good answer or a clear answer. And then, one of the main things I look for first is that just what is the foundation production schedule here? And then how do we start to piece this together so that no matter what, at least the production is staged on a weekly perpetual schedule? Right? So let's pivot the system and start to have tasks, headcount, processes happen exactly the same every single week. Let's at least start there. And then from there, let's dive into, okay, what's the infrastructure's capacity to actually achieve the goals that you've set forth for the business in relation to plant growth, the environment influencing growth, right? Humans don't grow plants. The environment humans manage, control plants. Right? So you have to appreciate the capacity of the infrastructure to create the environment you need to then satisfy the goals of the business with this crop. And so, usually I walk in and we look at this overall production schedule. We then evaluate the location, we evaluate the infrastructure, and then we evaluate the team, the true horticultural expertise, right? In traditional horticulture, you have a title called head grower, right? And a head grower is a grower that has grown at scale, has had over a decade, if not more, of experience at least, growing multiple crops, has most likely been educated in horticultural science, and is this kind of robust puzzle player within time, area, and business goals of managing plants. And in cannabis, you very rarely find that level of expertise managing a facility. You usually find, in some cases, a legacy grower who's doing their absolute best to run a business, manage a P&L, manage team members, be a leader of this business while still trying to follow company, targets and KPIs in relation to costs and revenue and yield. And we're missing in many businesses that key leader. And so anyway, you'll have me keep going. But yeah, we look at infrastructure, location, team, overall production schedule, and then we start to know how we can make tweaks to improve the business.
So you analyze all these things, Travis. Is there typically like one area after you like discuss it with their organization, like, hey, we see improvements need to be done here, here, and here? Is there typically one area you guys try to start with? Or is it kind of just a case by case basis? Each business is kind of different and you guys just kind of have to take it based on how that business is functioning as a whole during that time?
Yeah, so the two key things that really help me understand what the capability of the system is and where they are now is, again, first understanding, okay, what do you have in relation to infrastructure that can help you grow plants? And then how are you scheduling your area within a year, right, to optimize the performance of yield and growth and development of the crop? And so we usually like to focus on the production schedule first. And then we start to dive into, because the production schedule will help in management of all materials, management of all labor, help you understand in relation how to deal with, your photo periods and therefore your different energy usages. And, there's a lot there that we got to break out. But then,
just like systems in general, right?
Yes, systems in general. And it,
totally.
And kind of how we, a greenhouse is very different than an indoor production environment. But then, again, I walk into some systems and the facility looks nice, right? It's clean. It the technology seems like it's, right. And then you start to realize, okay, we've chosen the wrong LEDs. We've paid way too much for them. The benches are not the proper size for optimizing the square foot in that room. We're using a really crazy water infrastructure design to irrigate and manage fertilizer. You don't have enough airflow. You don't even know what your homogenized environment is because you don't have sensors deployed in the right places. Like there's a lot of things that we just kind of have to go in and audit. And that's really what due diligence does when we first get involved, right? And I guess we can probably get into some of this, but we have, 4 main service offerings. And one of those is to come in and do an audit of the cultivation unit. And so myself, as well as our VP of projects and due diligence, goes out, spends a few days, and we pretty much collect every single piece of document that a receiver would try and do due diligence on when a business goes into bankruptcy, right? So we look at all the financials, we look at all the production plans, all the, prior yields down to the cultivar level, and just start to understand the business. And then we start to systematically kind of put a new design in place for the business model with unit time, unit area, unit energy, and unit yield in mind, right? In how we build out and optimize the system.
I'm fascinated. I want to go back to what you said about the flowering for the 10 weeks. And you said you don't usually get a good answer. Is there a right answer, or is it based on the fact that that's how they used to do it for 10 weeks and that's what they found was best? And do you have a counter way to do it to understand, okay, this strain is best to do 8 weeks, this one is best for 12 weeks? How would you do it? And what is their typical response? And then how would you do it?
Yeah, so there's a few different things to think about here. So plants in general, and especially cannabis, is a light accumulator in its ability to then produce yield. And you could look at research from Utah State University by Dr. Bruce Bugbee and many others at this point that show the higher the light accumulation, the higher the yield. And one way that you can apply as much light as possible is growing the plant longer and accumulating more moles and therefore converting that into yield. And so there is throughout the flowering cycle of cannabis a trade-off to where at a certain point, the yield you'll accumulate, and I believe the photosynthetic absorption efficiency at that point is not worth continuing to grow when you could just put a new cycle in place, right? And so that's a piece of this. And then at the same time, you have growers just say, well, they don't finish until 10 weeks. Well, what do you define as finished? Right? I'm not going to tolerate amber trichomes. That's not an answer, right? That's just you making a visual observation. That's not quantifying anything. And then at the same time, as a grower, you're given a fixed and limited production area that you have to optimize within a year. And I like to look at a year because in a greenhouse, it's full circle. You go throughout the entire year, you go through the low season and peak season, rainy season, and then you're back, day one. And so if we look at an entire year and I'm given 100,000 square feet, how many times in a year can I turn that footprint to accumulate as many grams per square foot per year as possible while trying to maintain a fixed cost every week of the year? And so when we look at a 10-week cycle time compared to, let's say, a 7.5-week cycle time, if I'm able to, quote, finish the crop in 7.5 weeks of flowering, how many more times am I going to turn that facility within a year and accumulate that much more biomass that then just converts into revenue? And so that's a big piece of this. And there's a lot of research out there. And how do we get there? What is the right duration of flowering? Different genetics are different in relation to when they do truly finish. And then we're starting to also learn that, well, if we harvest a little earlier, we might end up having more potency because yield is not diluting it per the dilution effect of which we see in other crops. So there's a lot here in trying to optimize a system, and many systems are vastly different because they're in different locations. So you have to appreciate the ambient environment and its impact on this production schedule.
Are there certain KPIs though that you can measure in these facilities? Like I know you mentioned sensors. Is there other measurements that you can kind of help them or coach them to kind of grasp onto to help them determine that optimal time for turns in a cycle?
Yeah, so due diligence horticulture has enough experience now to where we can kind of step into a business and we have a playbook. And we have a playbook which is validated and vetted. And, I'm a real proponent And in some cases, some systems can't allow for this, and I can touch on that in a second. But I'm a big proponent of 2 weeks of propagation, 2 weeks of veg, and 7.5 weeks of flowering. And you turn that facility as aggressive and hard as you can. And there's certain things culturally within a greenhouse and being a cultivator that you can do to speed up flowering. Right. And we've done this in orchids. We've done this in other crops. There's different things you can do with nutrition and photoperiods and temperature to manipulate flower timing and other things. But what I educate team members of these businesses, especially when we come in to turn around and we maintain that team, is we start talking about 2 key metrics. One of these being, grams per square foot per cycle, right? So that's kind of our yield tracker on a weekly basis within a perpetual schedule. And then from there, we expand to start to understand what's called photon conversion efficiency, which is in the units of grams per mole of light, per meter squared, per cycle, and per year. And when you look at the research that's been done, you have a good appreciation for what's the potential, right, of a business. Like with the right system, with the right schedule, without any hiccups, with all the right cultural practices, what is the best that we could possibly do? And right now it's showing to be roughly 0.4 grams per mole per meter squared per cycle. That's the best of the best that we're seeing in relation to cultivation performance. Most groups are around 0.18 to 0.2. And that's where the grower comes into the equation, and not necessarily the hindrance due to infrastructure. Like, how is a grower choosing crop densities? How is a grower training the crop to optimize light capture? How are we optimizing our turn rate to then allow crops to constantly be on square footage, right? Not downtime and such, so that every single day we're converting light and energy into yield. And so that single metric then allows a business to start to break everything else out. What's our energy use efficiency? What's our water use efficiency, right? Because everything's tied to moles and how the plant uses light as its energy source. And there's a bunch of other calculations and models, scientific models behind this to justify that approach. But we try to educate on that and try to take whatever environmental data they have and system they have and start to say, okay, where are you? And I usually put a grade. I usually give the grower a grade from A to D. And it's like, okay, guys, we're at a C minus. We got to, get up to at least a B plus by the end of the year. Here's how we do it.
So I would assume, though, that can't be an easy conversation, right? You're having somebody who's doing the best. They're juggling multiple variables and they're like, hey, Travis, right? Like, I'm short staffed. Charlie doesn't ever come into work. Ron is never a good person. Like, when you come into the conversation, is it through an executive who's like, hey, Travis, I need you to come and help this person? Or is it the grower himself who's like, hey, Travis, like, we really need help. We struggled last turn and we're really looking to improve. Where do you come in? How does that relationship work, and define how you start the conversation?
Sure. So, when I'm asked what is due diligence horticulture, we are a cultivation operations service provider. And over the past 8 months, really, we've been able to find and start to work with multiple family offices, venture capital groups, debt lenders, and now even multiple court receivers that come to us and ask for either turnaround services or distressed asset revitalization. And so within our kind of portfolio of services, we offer distressed asset revitalization, which usually starts with a discussion with a receiver or an investor in the prior business that went out of business. We then also offer turnaround fractional, C-level services. So we come in as chief cultivation officer, chief operations officer, and we also have a financial firm we work with, so we can offer CFO services. And just kind of then in that level of a leadership role, start to grab the bull by the horns of the business, especially if it's a mainly cultivation focused business. And then our third offering is risk mitigation and innovation consulting. And so we have 7 clients throughout the US and Europe where we're only focused on what's next. How do we further optimize? And so, but yeah, usually engaged by the original investors of the business. That's how we've got most of our business to date.
So does that make for an interesting dynamic when the investor comes in and now quote unquote the lead grower needs to kind of follow suit and listen to your guys' new protocol? Is that an easy transition in terms of that conversation?
Yeah, it definitely can be sensitive.
That's a really good way to describe it.
But in many cases, these individuals at these businesses know this is coming, right? Like
That's a good point.
a lot of times these groups give these businesses, the chances that they deserve to try and turn things around. And at the end of the day, no one can do it alone. So more is better in that sense. And cultivation is a specific expertise, in my opinion, especially horticultural production. And so sometimes we go in and there's this new beautiful partnership that blooms, right, between our company and the current leadership there. And then they love the learning that comes from it. And we start to, get to a point where we turn the business around and start having the opportunity to then learn together with new innovations and new trials. And then sometimes we come in and the whole slate has to be wiped away and cleaned. And we start from the ground up and hire the entire team. It's really up to that grower. Like, are you just, here's another partner for your success. Let's do this together. And, we're going to have to implement what I say here up front. But believe me, this is going to pay off for both of us. It always does. So I try to be very sensitive because people put their heart and soul into these businesses in many cases. And you got to respect that.
Yeah, 100%. I have a random question. Is there any time where you come into one of these facilities and say it's in like a location that just doesn't have a strong cannabis market, and you like do the calculation and you're like, hey, from a business perspective, it actually might make more sense to grow this crop instead, just based on what you can potentially yield per square foot and some of the downturn in this specific market? Is there ever been a situation like that?
Yeah, there's been a few different capital groups that are interested in all of CEA, so controlled environment agriculture.
Okay,
And
thank
so
you.
we're also supporting vertical farming, leafy green growers, and can kind of show the pros and cons of this location's capacity for satisfying either of these business models. So we have had some of those discussions, and some of the discussions that we've had are, guys, I would not recommend any production here. I would sell this asset. I usually try to do everything I can to help someone make the most on something they've invested in, right? But at the same time, you need to cut your losses. Like, this is going to take an extreme amount of capital. The market's not there anymore. We just need to cut our losses here.
Certain times you just can't hit the benchmarks, right? And I think that's the important part. But do you need scientists on staff? Like what you talked about before seemed uber complicated, highly educated individuals. So like, do you need a team of scientists? Because what we've heard is sometimes people present these tools and these science and these metrics to hit, and it's very complicated for some of the individuals on the team to achieve that. So where is the balance scientifically? Do you need to have one scientist on staff, or you don't really need it, just an understanding of the principles?
Well, the scale of the business, right, and the overall vision of a business should help in understanding what type of level of expertise is needed, right? So like a real plant scientist on staff is also or should be tied into like product development and the whole go-to-market strategy with the brands and the value of the brands. And so, because the science will fuel everything. And so from that respect, yes, I think there is a responsibility for a business at scale to have, a director of research and somebody who understands the intricacies of helping optimize the system to satisfy the quality and the product goals of the business. But from my experience, like due diligence horticulture comes to the table with 2 PhDs on staff already. Right. So I have a director of technical support and a director of research that then is a constant support to this business. One of them is focused on innovation and research and development and product development in general. And I supply that, right, to the business. And then I have a director of technical support, which helps with everything from fertilizer mixing to IPM schedules to helping choose the right substrate and cost of substrate and vendor for that substrate. And so we kind of offer this expertise. But for other businesses, at the end of the day, if you have an efficient production schedule, a weekly perpetual schedule, some people have a daily, right? That's a different discussion. But the foundation of their production system doesn't necessarily require a PhD or a cultivation expert if they have the SOPs and that production schedule in place. It can just churn, right, and be on autopilot, which is what most companies need so they can focus on distribution and sales and manufacturing and optimizing the margin of that area of the supply chain. Most businesses don't have a churning autopilot cultivation business.
And then if like some technical issue comes up, then if they have someone like your guys' organization on call, then they can call you guys and rely on the expertise that you guys carry to provide that guidance just in that one minute moment, instead of carrying that high cost individual on staff that kind of hinders capital in this capital intensive space that is agriculture.
Yeah, exactly. We can automatically offer the support that's needed. And the good thing about how due diligence horticulture is structured is that we not only have the team internally, but we have 13 best in class vendor partners, right, that we've selected that work with us on most projects. So, for instance, let's say that I take over a greenhouse in Michigan, right? The first week I'm there, I have my water infrastructure, I have my lighting, I have my controls, and I have my consumable vendors on site with me. And we dive into everything. We start to understand, okay, what are you buying? Who are you buying it from? What are these costs? What is the, foundational algorithms in the background of your control system? What's not working in the greenhouse? And then how do we start to improve this system? And so we bring that team that's in addition to DDH, but they're incentivized to support what we're doing. And then at the same time, we're also tied into 3 different universities and supporting those universities. So, for example, there was a private university event in Colorado Sunday and Monday of this week, and we were the exclusive sponsor of that event. I think there was at least 4 universities represented there. And so we know who to reach out to when we can't answer a question.
Is one of the elements that your team brings, besides the expertise, maybe tools and sensors to allow for you or another member of your team to monitor the performance of the grow in real time, so that you can understand, okay, like this crop over here might have a problem. We need to do some investigative research, because as your team starts to scale, you need to be able to have visibility into the performance of the grow. So are you using tools and sensors in order to monitor that? How does that work?
Yeah, so one of the key values that we offer for those who hire us is a clear dashboard and tracking of the system, right? And so we have specific groups that we work with that enable us to, present kind of an overall business performance dashboard. And then at the same time, depending on the status of the business, where are we in relation to cash flow and available CapEx, we then can refine its ability and better data capture and collection with these vendors that we work with. And so, yeah, they can come in, we can design a whole system to then have confidence in understanding what actually is going on, and then track it back seasonally, track it back to cultivar performance and everything else to inform then future production forecasts going forward.
Any ag tech specifically for the plant to monitor the health of the plant in real time?
You mean a specific vendor?
No, just like in general, are there tools that your team uses to say, hey, like most growers don't use a tool to monitor the soil or to monitor moisture of the plant? Are there any things like that you found have been game changers for your team that most are just not considering currently?
I really think it's the basics. We rely on the basics. And in many cases, the businesses that we step in to manage or turn around, there's not necessarily a lot of capital at the beginning, right? We got to turn the business around and generate cash flow and then further enhance the system. And so it comes from a horticultural foundation and crop science foundation, right? Like what is light intensity? What is DLI? What is VPD? What are the average, relative humidity and parts per million of CO2 in this atmosphere? How confident are we on this being homogenized? Like there's a lot of things that we can kind of come in and take away from their current data to help them improve, but also know what's going on.
Are there certain metrics that your team uses to determine cultivation performance?
Yeah, the one I had mentioned a minute ago, what I call kind of the golden metric, is that photon conversion efficiency. Right?
What does that mean? Can you explain that?
Sure. So, what drives plant growth? Ultimately, photosynthesis. And what are the 3 inputs in photosynthesis? And this is water, light, and CO2, right? Many growers highly underestimate the impact of predominantly light and CO2 together and designed appropriately in their system to optimize yield. But those things come together to fuel plant growth and development in some cases. And in relation to development in cannabis, it's how you manipulate the photoperiod or the night length during different stages of production. And so once you can understand kind of the foundational science behind plant growth, you can then appreciate it being a light accumulator and using this energy to then, over time, accumulate yield before you harvest. And so a metric that's been used in decades in traditional horticulture is called DLI, daily light integral. This is moles per meter squared per day. And this is the accumulation of light within a given day, right? And the way that you measure this is first by taking light intensity, which is micromoles per meter squared per second, and calculating out the accumulation of that light intensity over the course of the photo period. In flowering, a photo period is 12 hours. What is that? Is it 30 moles? Is it 50 moles? Bruce Bugby shows the crop can be productive up to 70 moles, right? How many are we accumulating in a day? And then you look at, okay, how many photons, or rather moles, did we accumulate in the vegetative stage and all the way through flowering? What is our total moles in relation to total grams in a square meter, which is how light is measured in that amount of area? And then you can start to quantify grams per mole per meter squared per cycle. And this ties everything in. It ties in, if you're in a greenhouse, how you're optimizing inside the greenhouse versus the outside ambient environment. How are you leveraging what the infrastructure can do to optimize yield? And then how are you as a grower, optimizing your production area with cultural practices, plant count, and other things to make sure that you capture and accumulate that light. That is kind of the first step, going in and quantifying that with each grower.
Does it differ based on strain, right? Because I know that there's some strains that have like broad leaves, right? Some strains that have like thin leaves, right? So like, and correct me if I'm not an expert horticulture, right? Like if I speak of ignorance, please tell me so. But like if the leaf isn't as big, right? It's not going to have as much surface area, so it's not going to get as much light. So is that something that's factored into this equation or this calculation at all?
Sure. So, cannabis growers don't necessarily have the luxury to be that specific.
Okay,
right?
perfect.
And currently, and this may change as the markets become more mature, but growers have to constantly get new variety in their greenhouse. The sales team always wants more, always wants new. And so, to think that we can optimize a system for one or two cultivars isn't practical right now. And so I have found that as long as a crop, and a crop meaning a single cycle with multiple varieties, is trained the right way, and you have a robust production system and a robust environment to push the yields and quality that you want out of this crop, you can be confident on average yields and average performance within that given population. Right. So there will always be differences in variety in relation to cannabinoid profiles, in total yield per cultivar. But I do believe that how you deploy certain cultural practices like topping and pinching and when those events happen, right, and how you train all of these plants the exact same way, you're going to optimize the performance of that system, regardless of the varieties.
Have you found that like premium plants need different sort of nutrients and resources versus like lower end? Is there any sort of differences between the higher end buds and the lower end buds between the two different strains?
Certain varieties certainly have different quality attributes. And so some varieties have fabulous flower, but they're hard rooters. They're not aggressive growers. And then therefore, let's say the irrigation regime would need to be different for them than others. From my perspective, get rid of that. Select genetics that have good average performance, right? And allow you to manage an efficient production system and utilize the science that's out there to optimize quality. And you can have good quality with a wide array of genetics.
What is quality? Let's just define quality.
Oh, Lord. Yeah, you would ask me that.
Well, I mean, realistically, like quality for Kellen, quality for me, very different. Quality for Travis, very different.
Yeah, so, if you look at kind of the research that's been done and you look at how universities are conducting studies in relation to trying to control quality, quality is defined by quality attributes which can be measured and quantified, right? So percent terpenes per pound, percent cannabinoids per pound, moisture content, water activity. That's quality because that's what a grower has control over. When we start to talk about frostiness, we start to talk about the squeeze test, we start to, talk about terpenes that have volatilized within a bag that you open and then smell that are not representative of what's on the product. Like the way quality is defined and determined from the end consumer and bulk buyer perspective is not yet aligned in many cases with how we quantify quality. And it makes it incredibly difficult to therefore improve quality, right? And so in some cases, this is where legacy growers may be of most value, is they know that that product is quality. And I'm like, that goes against everything I've seen on every freaking COA that, and I'm trying to manipulate this environment to make potency spike on this date. I'm trying to do this with drying to get water activity to this point, right? And he's like, no, this is quality. And so we still have a long way to go, and I think how the industry goes about determining quality, if we do it right, is going to significantly and positively influence buyer value of the product and open up possibly some new market space. We are not anywhere near there yet.
That's like why I think we want to dive into, because I think quality is subjective. And exactly like you said, is like if the end consumer feels like this is quality, but the grower internally is like, hey, like we're not aligned, then you've got a real discrepancy. Do people ever come to you and say, hey, Travis, like this strain is going to be extracted, so we want to push these specific characteristics to be super high terps, high potency? Do they ever manipulate the plant like that, knowing that the next step is extraction?
Certainly. So let's say that you have two different facilities and you want to produce X amount of extract from internal channels as well as X amount of flower. Let's say that it causes you to separate both of these two facilities as doing both of those. So like a 50-50 ratio, this amount of area is going to be focused on extract, this amount of area is going to be focused on flower. You treat those two production systems vastly different. Your cropping densities, your flower times, the date at which you harvest are vastly different in an extract system versus a flowering system. So there's a certain point throughout the flowering cycle where yield will outpace potency. And this has been proven. And so it is in your best interest to harvest early in some cases to optimize your potency per pound so that your extraction efficiency is optimized at that point. Whereas if I were to harvest at that same date for finished flower, the flower wouldn't even visually look finished in some cases. So there are really different strategies based on what your goals are for the business and the margin you need to maintain and the price that you're targeting in the market and how you go about scheduling these crops to satisfy those.
You have to be super dialed in, though, as an organization, right? As a vertical organization, yes, to have those numbers, because it seems like, in my opinion, some companies try, hey, like grow this the best you can, push the yield. But what you're saying is a more intuitive understanding of like, okay, like this batch is going to extraction, so we should push it for here. This is going for just flowering. So 50-50, 100% of the organizations, what percentage of organizations do you think are that dialed to have an understanding of do this for this and this for this, if you just had a guess?
I haven't seen many, maybe if at all necessarily. It's more of kind of a, fly by the seat of our pants. The market changes so quickly and so drastically in some cases, you got to just constantly pivot. And by the time you pivot, something else is coming around the corner and you thought you had a forecast that's going to help you get to the point you want to be in the next year, but now you got to completely change again. And so the pace of the market and the changes within the market do not help growers or production systems be efficient in this manner because lead times associated with change in cultivation are long. That's part of the challenge. Like if I make a change today, you're not going to see it for 18 weeks, right? At least. I mean, if I change genetics in stock, we're talking 6 months, if not more. And so it's challenging for businesses. And in the ornamental world, annual and perennial crops, right? Everything trickles down from sales. Right? What varieties I'm growing, when they need to be ready, which store they're going to, what volume, blah, 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 right? And then you just schedule your systems, schedule your production, procure the genetics, and go. Right now, if anything, it's the grower saying, guys, I got a cool variety. How do we take it to market? It's coming from the opposite direction out to the market. So there's a lot of improvement that needs to be had there when we look at traditional horticultural systems.
Right. It's like, he's like, hey, I couldn't sell this strain, so now we're extracting it. And then they're like, hey, the extract did great. Sales are through. We need more extract. And they're like, no, we only usually do trim. That was like a one-time thing because we couldn't sell that flower. And now they have this whole like they're just chasing their own tail at that point. But they had to do that to survive, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then if you were to make a change based on now that new priority, by the time it comes to fruition, it's going to be completely
Yeah,
different.
totally.
And so that is hard. And that's also hard in relation to businesses being comfortable allocating whatever capital they have to improve cultivation, because the results of that take so long to see. And so whereas, a company could take a single dollar and turn it into $1.25 at retail within a month and a half, they take that same dollar and put it into cultivation for $4 later, and they see it next year. That's a challenging piece of all of this. And that's, in my opinion, why many businesses are going out of business.
And just to layer on the complications, right? It's not like you can grow your weed in, let's say, California and ship it all across the United States, and then the consumer can get the same experience every time they pick up, that sour diesel from your favorite brand. Instead, you've got these siloed organizations in different states growing all, hopefully, the same strain to have the same continuity. Is that nearly impossible? Close? Is it like, because I know that people can grow things that are the same name, but the experience is different. How does that work? Is there any chance to have the same sort of experience and taste and flavor across different states?
Yeah. So even when you look at most MSOs in their different states, they have vastly different systems. And depending on the state, they may not even be able to have the same variety to grow. And, that's in itself a whole nother side of this market, because, we don't even yet have plant or utility patents on genetics. People are changing names every day for convenience and trying to just show they're offering something new when in fact they're not. And, these different systems cause different plant performance and quality attributes. And so therefore the user experience is going to change. And then the science of user experience is vast. So I see that being challenging. Now with flower products, with extracted products, there's no reason why you can't formulate a very similar, if not the exact same product. But yeah, for stuff coming out of the cultivation unit, that's hard.
But it's wild because like people don't expect the same thing like out of their broccoli. You know what I mean? Like I don't expect like
I do.
I do too.
Have you ever had broccoli not taste like broccoli before?
Well, I guess that was a really bad agricultural example.
They call that cauliflower, Kellen. Travis, what is the most common misconception about cannabis cultivation?
Most common misconception that it can be as standardized as people think. I have a lot of different leaders in many of these businesses who just expect it to be able to track performance and, follow suit to exactly hitting these numbers every single week. And, plants don't work that way, guys. We're growing a living organism here. We're subject to changes in the, natural environment. We have so many things we can't control. Like we can't even use pesticides. We can't use plant growth regulators, which influence the consistency and stability of plant performance in other markets. Like we don't even have, in some cases, stable genetics. I am not even guaranteed any of our facilities are clean of hop latent viroid, which throws in curveballs left and right if you're not careful. There's just so much out there that makes this not like a manufacturing facility. And a lot of people need to realize the complexities with plant science and learn it's a different model completely.
What question do you wish more people asked you?
You ask good questions, Brian. I want to give good answers, but all right. How much better could we do? Right? A lot of people seem to be satisfied, or they have so much pride about what they do that they don't feel there's significant opportunity to improve. So I'm never really asked that when I would love to share thoughts on it.
Do you think it's based on the fact that there's so many challenges they're facing that they're just doing the best they can to survive? Maybe it's like the thought process, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And currently to them, they're just not aware that they've got an opportunity to increase yields tremendously by making these improvements?
So if I didn't go through the schooling that I went through, if I didn't work in the ornamental industry and worked with experienced growers and researchers, I would not understand the extent of the intricacies of plant science that I do now. So without any of that, I probably could have thought, okay, this is the best we can do, but now I realize you can always do better. There's so much we just still don't know today, even about petunias and tomatoes. And there's always something to improve on. And that's where they really need to work with, in my opinion, someone like due diligence or other groups out there that bring that extra level of continuous improvement thinking to the table. You can't just put blinders on in your own production and think that you're on the right path. You've got to learn from others. You've got to be open.
Love it. All right, prediction time. Travis, how do you see the role of technology evolving in cannabis cultivation over the next 5 years?
I think we're going to see a lot of exciting technology in relation to determining quality without human intervention, as well as automation specific to the crop and system. And so like you're starting to see some really exciting robotics and like strawberry harvesting on vertical indoor racks. They're using drones outside to manipulate photo periods on perennials. And then you have, companies like Specs AI doing spectral imaging on chlorophyll concentrations in relation to hop latent viroid infection. There is so much that's coming down the pipe. And then we dealt with COVID, and in many systems, let's say all of a sudden 14 people have to go home for 20 days. Automation's got a huge place in horticulture. And so, yeah, that's an exciting topic.
Love it. Kellen, you want to take a swing?
I do, but first I want to say apples. That's what the agricultural product I should have went with instead of broccoli.
Not broccoli.
There are different apples, right? Like Washington apples, and they just, they're from Washington. All right, but back to the...
We're editing that
part out. No, I completely agree with Travis. So I think automation is going to be the future, right? Like you're going to just see more robotics be integrated within agricultural processes throughout every industry, right? It just makes a lot of sense. It'll help yields, it'll help costs, it'll help lower the cost of food and agricultural commodities for everyone in the world, right? So I think that's why these technologies are going to be driven into not only cannabis agriculture, but all agriculture in general. What do you think, Brian?
I think it's a balance, right? I think technology can make a massive difference, and we can apply all the technology that's used in agriculture and horticulture previously with all the other crops we use. We can apply specific aspects of it to cannabis to benefit us in all the ways. But I think it starts with having a plan, a focus of what metrics of success we're going for, and then instituting an organization that allows for success across an organization. I think what you broke down, Travis, today is like understanding really where your North Star was, and then bringing everyone together to focus like, okay, like if this is our metric for success, here's how we should be thinking about step by step to get there. And I can only hope that as we continue forward, organizations continue to contact you, Travis, and put together those principles so that like we can move on in the right direction, because ultimately the consumer benefits the most from that.
Yeah, definitely. Couldn't agree more. Yeah. And I think just another point on technology is ultimately when you build a system, it should be now focused on implementation of automation, spectral imaging from the start, right? And start to implement this technology. Coming back with retrofitted systems is always going to be challenging. So the future is also going to be in new facilities that adopt this technology.
100%. So Travis, for our listeners, they want to get in touch, they want to contact you to help them with their grow facility. Where can they find you?
Sure. info@ddhort.com. We'll soon have an Instagram as well as a website. Don't yet. We haven't necessarily needed to. But yeah, that email address, or if not, reach out to us on LinkedIn.
Awesome. We'll link it up in the show notes. Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thank you.